Alright guys, so today we're going to be solving this quadratic by factoring. The first thing that you have to look for is that it's set equal to 0. If it's not set equal to 0, you have to move whatever's over here onto this side to get it to be equal to 0. After it's equal to 0, I'm going to look at this side and I'm going to see if 4x squared, negative 4x, and negative 8 have any greatest common factor I can simplify out before I factor. In this case, there is a greatest common factor of 4. So I'm going to go ahead and divide out 4 out of each of these terms, and that gives me 4 parentheses x squared minus x minus 2 equals 0. And now I'm just going to factor what's in my parentheses, and I'm going to factor by the reverse box method. So with the reverse box method, you do a 2 by 2 box. And what I do is I always put my very first term in the first box and my last term in the last box. And then I multiply the coefficient of my first term, which here is an invisible 1, by my last term, my constant term. So 1 times negative 2 gives me negative 2. And then I list underneath that all the factors of negative 2. So I have 1 times negative 2 and negative 1 times a positive 2. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick or choose the factor pair that adds up to be my middle term. Well, my middle term here is going to be negative 1. It's not written in there, but I could go ahead and write it in as negative 1. The factor pair that adds up to be negative 1 is this one, because 1 plus negative 2 equals negative 1, and this is my middle term. So this is going to be the factor pair that I'm going to choose. And I'm going to put an x by each of these numbers. So 1x and negative 2x. And if I combine these together, I'd be back at negative 1x. So I'm not changing the value or anything. I'm just choosing to split this middle term up into these two terms so that I can fully fill in my box. Okay, so then what I do is I like to, either with my hand or with a little piece of paper, cover up the bottom row, and I ask myself, what does the first row have in common? So x squared and 1x, they have an x in common. And then I say x times what gives me x squared? Well, x times x gives me x squared. X times 1 gives me 1x because we're multiplying rows times columns. And then x times, I come down here, x times what gives me negative 2x is negative 2. And then I always double check the last row times column, which is negative 2 times 1. Does negative 2 times 1 give me negative 2? And yes, it does. So the outsides of the box are going to be your binomials. So this is going to be x minus 2. And then from up here, x plus 1, and you could have written that in either order, so like x plus 1 times x minus 2, that's fine. And this is still equal to 0, and then you have to remember to bring down your GCF, which is 4. Okay, so now that I have it in factored form, I can take each of my binomials and set those equal to 0 in order to solve for x. So I have x minus 2 equals 0, and x plus 1 equals 0. And I'm going to go ahead and solve by x by doing inverse operations. So the opposite of subtracting 2 is adding 2 to each side. So for my first solution, I get x equals 2. And over here, the inverse of adding 1 is subtracting 1, so I get x equals negative 1. So these are my two solutions for this quadratic. If you wanted to go ahead and check them, you could just plug them back into the original to make sure that they came out to be true. Alright, so that's how you solve a quadratic by factoring. Alright, thank you guys. Have a great day.